George's phone buzzed with an alert, breaking the monotony of his drive. He glanced at the screen, half expecting it to be a work email, but instead it was a notification that his business trip had been canceled, leaving him with an unexpected free evening. A smile tugged at the corners of his mouth. He imagined his wife Jessica's delight when he walked through the door, a bottle of her favorite wine in hand, and they'd have a quiet dinner together. When George pulled into his driveway, he was surprised to see Michael's car parked at the curb. Carrying the bottle of wine and the small bouquet of roses he had picked up, George quietly approached the front door. He noticed it was slightly ajar, which was odd. Jessica was always meticulous about locking up, especially when she was home alone. "Jess?" he called out, the usual warmth in his voice replaced by a hint of uncertainty. There was no reply, just the faint sound of murmured voices coming from upstairs. George frowned, his heart rate picking up as he placed the wine and flowers on the hallway table. The voices were low, too low to make out clearly. He moved quietly, the sounds from upstairs becoming clearer with each step. The voices were more distinct now. Jessica's soft laughter, a sound he hadn't heard in weeks, and a hushed murmur that could only belong to Michael. George's breath caught in his throat. His hand hovered over the door to their bedroom, which was slightly cracked open. The scene before him hit like a physical blow. Jessica and Michael were on the bed, entangled in a passionate embrace that left no room for doubt. George's world tilted, his vision blurring as he struggled to comprehend what he was seeing. The bottle of wine and the flowers suddenly felt like cruel jokes, reminders of a life he thought was still his. For a moment, George couldn't move. His body refused to obey the instinct to run, to confront, to do anything other than stand there, frozen in disbelief. Jessica's laughter, the way she whispered Michael's name, these were sounds that should have been reserved for him, not his best friend. Neither of them saw George, so he turned and left, leaving the house without a word. When he returned at the usual time he was supposed to come home, Michael was nowhere to be found. Jessica was all smiles, and the sight of her made him sick. Quietly, he started to come up with a plan. It was a plan that would ensure that his wife, or soon-to-be ex-wife, would not be able to screw him over in the divorce, and he could make an easy break. The first step was to ensure Jessica wouldn't be able to take any of his wealth. It was a decent amount, and he didn't want her to have any of it. After talking to his lawyer, George was able to invest it in savings. He did his best to make sure when his wife found out about the divorce, he would be worth nothing. Perhaps it was cruel, but Jessica had her job, and she got a decent wage. There was just no way he wanted Jessica to have a penny of what he worked hard for. Everything he had worked for in these past few years seemed pointless. George went to college, married a woman he thought was decent, and had that American dream everyone always talked about. He now felt dejected, like he had been sold a bed of lies. With nothing more than a note, George decided he was going to take a clean break from not only Jessica, but his life. His family had died years ago, leaving him an orphan. All he had was Jessica and Michael, or so he thought. The note said he was done and wanted a new life. On the table were also the divorce papers. If she didn't sign them, then George would deal with that when he had to. But he had a feeling his soon-to-be ex-wife wouldn't hesitate to sign the divorce papers. She'd want to be with Michael after all. George packed a small bag and put on his best shoes. He didn't even take his car because George truly did want a clean break from this life. Everything he owned in this house and on this property was tied to Jessica. It was a reminder of a life that was an entire sham. Nothing about it was the truth. The morning he left, George took a bus to the closest highway. Then he started hitchhiking on the side of the road. He wasn't sure where he was going, other than he wanted to get as far away from this area as he could. His wife's betrayal was still fresh in his mind, but whenever he thought of it, he felt numb. George wondered if perhaps he was in shock. The shock made him feel nothing. Eventually, the shock would wear off, leading to him accepting the truth of the situation. George wasn't going anywhere in particular. He wanted to put as much distance between his wife as possible. When leaving, George hadn't even taken much money with him. Let her have the money that he hadn't put into the businesses to keep them out of her grubby hands. The longer George walked, the more he realized that all the dreams he had been working towards for the past 5 years were for nothing. To think that just a week or two ago, George had been heading over heels in love with her. They were discussing having children and taking the next step. He always wanted children. It was a dream for him to have a family one day. It was supposed to be with Jessica, but that ship had sailed. How could she have cheated on him with his friend of all people? It seemed like a cruel joke or some kind of story you'd find in one of those cheap, tawdry talk shows. The longer he walked, the more his feet ached. But no cars were stopping, so George had no choice but to keep up his walking. He would occasionally stick out his thumb to try to see if someone would pick him up, but they didn't stop for him. Who knows the reason why? It could be something as simple as they were driving too fast and didn't see him. Shrugging, George kept walking along the road. He kept seeing signs for a truck stop up ahead and told himself he would stop there to recharge. There he could use the bathroom, grab some food and get some water. Hopefully, he would be able to catch a ride with some truckers. But it all depended on whether they took pity on him or not. When the truck stops finally came into sight, he let out a sigh of relief. George jogged the rest of the way, his feet screaming in protest. He didn't sit down until he had purchased a snack and a bottle of water, gulping down half of it in one gulp. Sighing, George made himself comfortable on the table with a tired sigh. He took a drink and overheard a conversation from the table nearby. George didn't mean to eavesdrop, but they were very close as well as very loud. "Ben, what are we going to do?" The man sighed. "I don't know, Monica. We have only 2 days before we need to find a replacement for Daniel, and with cattle prices going down, it's not like we can afford to have more than one on the farm anyway." "How are we going to find someone willing to work for such a low wage?" Monica cried. "There is no way someone is going to want to work for us for what is essentially peanuts, and it's not like we can work the farm. We're over the hill." Ben wrapped an arm around Monica. "I know, hun, but we'll figure it out. We always have in the past, so why would this be any different?" "Because we're older and have virtually no money, Ben. I love you, but you need to be realistic about this." George's eyes widened. He felt like this was his chance to get himself back on track. It wasn't much, but he was aimless, unsure of what to do with himself. Some good hard work would be a great way to help him get over the death of his marriage, essentially. Clearing his throat, George approached the couple with a smile. "Hello, I couldn't help overhearing that you need a new farmhand." Ben frowned, eyeing George suspiciously. "Listen, buddy, I'm not in the mood for whatever game you're playing. We're having a real crisis right now. Some stranger trying to get his jollies by pranking an elderly couple is just not what we need." "Sir, I'm not playing tricks with you. I'm in quite a spot myself and could use a job," George replied, trying to sound earnest. "You don't even have to pay me. I'm willing to work for free in exchange for food and shelter." Ben narrowed his eyes. "Why are you offering to work for free? Nobody does that unless they're hiding something. What's your story?" George hesitated but knew honesty was his best shot. "I'm going through a rough patch. Just had a major life change, and I need something to keep me occupied. I've got a strong back, I'm good with my hands, and I know my way around a farm. My grandfather had one, and I spent summers working there. I'm not looking to cause trouble, just trying to find some stability." Monica blinked. "That's all well and good, but we're talking about more than just lifting hay bales. Do you know how to handle livestock? Fix fences? Do you have any experience with tractors or machinery?" George nodded. "Yes, ma'am. I've done all that. Like I said, I've spent a lot of time on a farm. I can repair equipment, mend fences, and even help with the harvest. I'm a quick learner if there's something I don't know." Ben folded his arms, still unconvinced. "What about your situation? Why aren't you working somewhere else? Why here, and why now?" George sighed, deciding to share just enough. "I recently went through a divorce. Lost my way a bit, and I'm just looking for a place where I can be useful, where I can put my mind to something other than what I've been dealing with. I don't have anywhere else to go right now, and I figured maybe helping you could help me too." Monica glanced at Ben, who was still skeptical, but seemed to be softening. "Ben, we need the help, and he seems harmless enough. It's not like we have much anyway, so robbing us can't be his goal," she said, laughing lightly. "When can you start?" "Monica!" Ben shouted. "Ben, come on, we both know we're in over our heads right now. Let's give him a chance." Ben sighed heavily, finally relenting. "Fine, but don't think we won't keep an eye on you, George." George nodded, understanding their caution. "I wouldn't expect anything less. I can start right away. Monica smiled warmly. Great. My name is Monica, and this is my husband, Ben. Ignore the sourpuss on his face. He's in a bit of a mood. I am not in a mood, Ben muttered, but the tension had clearly eased. Chuckling, George sat back down and waited for them to finish their meal. When they were done, he hopped into the back of their truck and rode with them to the farm. They had a spare room on the first floor, which was all George needed. He was good if he had a bed and a warm meal. Sleeping at Monica and Ben's farm felt like a brand new start. He got up bright and early, ready to start the day. Already on the farm was an older black man named Tom. Tom lived on the property as well in a small house that used to be his parents'. When Ben and Monica bought the land, they decided to hire Tom. He had been working there for years and was like a part of the family at this point. I'm George, he greeted, holding out his hand to the man. Tom took his hand, shaking it firmly. I'm Tom. Ben and Monica just hired me the other day. I heard them talking at the truck stop and thought it sounded like a good opportunity. Tom didn't respond much to what George was saying. It was only when he directly asked him a question that Tom said something. But Tom didn't mind George talking to him. He let George ramble on about anything that came to mind. Another thing George noticed was that he was very closed off and didn't like to answer any questions about his life either. He tried to respect that, focusing on doing his work and not making idle conversation. But Tom was a great worker, and George wanted to strive to be one as well. He put his head and soul into working at the farm, never allowing himself much of a break. If he took a break, then he would let his mind wander to Jessica and Michael. The first day he worked on the farm, he did think of the two of them. But it was a very brief and fleeting thought. It was gone almost as soon as it appeared. Garog realized that she had made her bed, and now she had to lie in it, literally and figuratively. Manual labor wasn't something George had done for many years. He grew up poor and had to work for everything he had, so it wasn't like he wasn't accustomed to hard work. It had just been a long time since he had to deal with any work like this. George had spent most of his adult life in the city, working and just hustling every day to make money to afford the lifestyle he and Jessica were accustomed to. But after a week of working on the farm, George realized how happy he was here. For one, it was quiet. It was also easy to wake up every morning and start doing his job with no one constantly looking over his shoulder, micromanaging him. The farm, as difficult as this work could be, was peaceful. He had never felt so at peace in his entire life. But it wasn't all quiet and peaceful on the farm. It had nothing to do with Monica and Ben. One night while George lay in the barn, the faint creak of wood and shuffling steps pulled him from sleep. Frowning, he sat up, his senses alert. The usual peaceful quiet of the farm was gone, replaced by strange noises. George's heart raced as he heard the low murmur of voices, too far away to make out clearly, but close enough to know something wasn't right. He quickly grabbed his rifle from where it rested against the wall, quietly loading a round. The cold night air prickled his skin as he moved through the shadows, following the sounds toward the back of the property. Near the fence, barely visible in the moonlight, were two figures huddled together. They were whispering, but George could catch snatches of their conversation as he crept closer. "Dude, hurry the hell up. If someone catches us, we're screwed," one of them hissed, his voice filled with urgency. The second guy, taller and more rugged, gave an annoyed grunt. "Calm down. Nobody's out here at this time." George's eyes narrowed. The two of them couldn't have looked shadier, and whatever they were planning, it wasn't good. He stepped out of the shadows, the rifle in his hands, and cleared his throat loudly to make his presence known. "Too late," George said, his voice steady as he raised the rifle and pointed it squarely at them. The two men whipped around, their eyes wide with shock. The shorter one took a step back, his face pale in the dim light. "Shit, who the hell are you?" The taller guy, clearly the leader, scowled, trying to act tough despite the weapon now aimed at them. "Hey, why don't you get the hell out of here, okay? Mind your business, buddy." George didn't flinch, his grip on the rifle steady. "This farm is my business, and you're trespassing. If you two don't get out of here right now, I won't hesitate to shoot." The taller man laughed bitterly, glancing at his partner. "You don't have the guts to pull that trigger." George took a slow step forward, his eyes locked on the man's. "Try me." A tense silence settled over the field, the only sound the distant wind rustling through the trees. George kept his stance firm, his finger hovering just over the trigger. He didn't want to shoot, but he needed them to believe he would. The shorter guy tugged on his partner's sleeve, panic creeping into his voice. "Come on, man, let's just go. We don't need this." But the taller man was stubborn, his jaw clenched tight as he glared at George. "You're making a big mistake, pal. You don't know who you're messing with." George's eyes hardened. "You've got 3 seconds to get out of here." 1. The shorter man's eyes widened and he yanked harder on his partner's arm. "Dude, let's go. He's serious." 2. The tall man hesitated, his bravado faltering as George took another step closer, the rifle still aimed dead center. His partner was already backing away, clearly wanting no part of this anymore. "Damn it!" The taller man spat on the ground, casting one last hateful look at George, before turning to run after his partner. "This isn't over!" he shouted over his shoulder as they both bolted into the darkness, disappearing over the fence. George stood there for a moment, his heart pounding in his chest as the adrenaline surged through him. He kept the rifle raised, his eyes scanning the perimeter until he was sure they were gone. Finally, he lowered the weapon, his breath coming out in a slow, controlled exhale. He glanced around the quiet farm, tension still buzzing under his skin. For now, the threat was gone, but something told him those two weren't the type to give up easily. When George shared this incident with Ben, the elderly farm owner just sighed and shook his head. "Those boys you ran into last night were the McFarland boys. Their father owns the farm right next to us and has been trying to get our farm for years so they can expand theirs." Monica sat down at the breakfast table and sighed. "It gets worse. Their uncle is the chief of police, so anytime we call the law on them, nothing happens. We've been fighting with them for years now. Monica and I are getting up there, so we're getting tired of it," Ben lamented. "One day they'll end up taking the farm. Monica and I just must accept that." George wanted to tell them that it wasn't right for them to give up so easily. The McFarland family didn't have the right to torment them just because they wanted to take the farm. To make matters worse, those boys were constantly getting off the hook because their uncle was a member of the local police. They were creating monsters. Those boys were already in their early 20s, so they weren't boys. The damage was done already, and there was no changing the way they were doing. George grew angry whenever he thought of them, but after seeing them that night, he didn't end up seeing them again, which he was grateful for. George didn't want to see those two guys again. They were nothing but trouble, making him wish they would leave Monica and Ben alone. The elderly couple had been nothing but great to him. However, as much as he loved being on the farm, he was starting to feel a little bit antsy about it. It wouldn't hurt for him to get out of the house, so to speak, and go into the nearby town. When he asked Ben if he could borrow his truck, Ben nodded. "Of course, go ahead. Just leave the keys on the table when you get back." Grinning, George hopped in the truck and drove into town. He found himself at the bar, which was the busiest place in the town. When he walked in, everyone stopped and stared at him. George smiled awkwardly, trying to ignore them as he sat at the bar. Eventually, the stares began to fade, and the patrons of the small-town bar returned to their conversations, card games, and drinks. George understood why they had been staring at him. He was the new guy in this tight-knit community, and curiosity was inevitable. Small towns didn't get many newcomers, and George was the latest topic of interest. He made his way to the bar, his boots scuffing against the worn wooden floor. "Excuse me, could I get a beer?" he asked, his voice low but polite. The bartender, a grizzled man with a salt and pepper beard, nodded and began pouring the drink. George could feel the weight of lingering glances on his back, but he ignored them, focusing on the game playing on the TV above the bar. He took a slow sip, letting the cold beer settle his nerves, and tried to enjoy the hum of the bar's atmosphere. Suddenly, a sharp voice cut through the noise, jarring him from his thoughts. "Hey, you!" The voice was familiar, and George's stomach tightened with unease. He turned, his hand still wrapped around the beer glass, and his eyes met the sneering faces of the McFarland boys. They were trouble, and he knew it the moment he saw them. "Oh, you two," he muttered under his breath, more to himself than to them. The taller of the two, who had a permanent scowl etched on his face, sneered and closed the distance between them, his breath reeking of alcohol. He loomed over George, his eyes cold and menacing. "What do you mean, oh, you?" the tall one demanded, his voice dripping with hostility. George blinked, trying to keep his cool. "I mean, I'm not happy to see you." The two brothers exchanged a glance before bursting into harsh laughter. It wasn't the kind of laughter that lightened a mood. It was the kind that made your skin crawl. "Yeah, well, this is our town," the shorter brother chimed in, his voice sharp with aggression. Before George could react, the taller one shoved him hard in the chest. The force of the push sent him stumbling off the bar stool, his beer sloshing onto the floor. George caught his balance just in time, his eyes narrowing as he glared at the two brothers. The bar had gone deathly quiet, all eyes now focused on the brewing confrontation. George could feel the tension crackling in the air, like the calm before a storm. "Back off," George warned, his voice low and dangerous, though he knew it was unlikely they'd listen. The brothers just smirked, enjoying the attention they were getting from the crowd. The taller one cracked his knuckles. "You think you can just waltz into our town and do whatever you want? Not gonna happen, buddy." George didn't flinch, but he knew he was in for it. The bar's patrons weren't likely to intervene, not with the McFarlands involved. He clenched his fists, readying himself for the inevitable. "Leave it alone, boys," the bartender called out, but his voice lacked conviction. He knew as well as George did that the McFarlands weren't the type to back down. Without another word, the Towler brother swung first, his fist connecting with George's jaw, sending him reeling back into a nearby table. The shorter brother was on him in an instant, throwing a punch that caught George in the ribs. Pain exploded in his side, but George managed to shove him off, only to be hit again, this time by the taller one. It was 2 against 1, and George quickly found himself outmatched. He landed a few solid hits, but the McFarlands were relentless, fueled by anger and a need to assert their dominance. The fight spilled across the bar, chairs scraping against the floor as they struggled. George was on the ground now, the brothers towering over him. The taller one kicked him hard in the side, and George felt the wind rush out of him. He tried to get up, but another punch to the face knocked him back down, his vision blurring as pain seared through him. By the time the bartender managed to intervene, George was a bloody mess, with a black eye and a nose that wouldn't stop bleeding. The McFarlands stood over him, satisfied with their work, before the bartender finally pulled them away. "That's enough," the bartender shouted, his voice trembling with anger. "Get out of here before I call the sheriff." The brothers sneered but didn't argue. They threw one last contemptuous look at George before swaggering out of the bar, leaving him on the floor, gasping for breath and wiping blood from his face. The bar slowly returned to normal, the patrons resuming their conversations, though with an undercurrent of unease. George struggled to sit up, his body aching from the beating. The bartender handed him a rag, sympathy in his eyes. "No one likes McFarlands here," the bartender muttered. "The only reason we tolerate them is because they have so much money. Otherwise, we would tell them to march out of town and never have to see their ugly mugs again." George smiled weakly. He just sat there, sipping his second beer that the bartender gave him for free. When it was close to 11 p.m., he got up and left. It was when he got to the truck that he saw that a derogatory word had been spray-painted on the side of Ben's truck. Could this night get any worse? George thought to himself. He headed back to the farm and tried to get rid of the paint. It came off after and Harv trying to scrub it, leaving him with nothing left to do but go to bed. When he got up in the morning, George headed straight to the couple. He knew he was going to get fired today. There was no way Ben and Monica were going to keep him on. Why would they after everything he had done last night? "Could I speak with you two for a moment?" he asked, hanging his head. Mancha frowned. "Of course, George. Please sit. What is this about?" "It's about last night when I got into town," Giroux whispered. "I ran into the McFarland boys, and we got into a fight." Ben winced. "I can see from the state of you that you lost. Not that it's a surprise." "Those boys never fight fair," Mancia snapped. "Their entire lives they have always played dirty, letting Daddy and their uncle clean up their messes." George cleared his throat. "It's much worse. When I got out of the bar, it turned out that they had spray-painted something terrible on the truck. I tried to wash it off, and most of it did come off, but there's still some left." "Oh, well, that's—" "I understand if you want to fire me. It wasn't right of me to engage in a fight with them under any circumstances. I mean, they defaced your truck. Ben laughed. George, do you want some breakfast and coffee? Muncie had just finished making fresh eggs and coffee. Didn't you hear what I said, though? I said, we heard you, George, but we aren't going to fire you just because those horrid boys goaded you into a fight. It wasn't your fault. George sat down, shock running through his body. You guys are amazing. We try, Monica said with a playful wink. Ben, while I finish cooking, why don't you talk to George about our background with the McFarlands and why we are so insistent on hanging on to the farm? Ben grinned. Oh, I do love telling stories. You ready, George? He couldn't believe they were willing to let him off the hook. These two were truly amazing and didn't have a mean bone in their body if they were willing to forgive him for the previous night. Ready as I'll ever be, George said, grinning. Ben laughed. Well, see, this farm is our pride and joy, but the older we've got, the more difficult it's been for us to maintain it, as you already know. Sometimes I've been tempted to say, screw it, and sell it off to the McFarlands. Maybe after we sell it, we can move somewhere else, where we don't have to work so hard to maintain a property. I see, George said, nodding to him. Please continue. The main reason we have held on to the farm is because of our daughter, Emily. She's finishing grad school where she is studying agriculture and farming. Once she finishes school, she's going to come back and make the farm survive. He blinked. Oh, I didn't know you had a daughter. Sorry? I can't believe we haven't brought her up to you yet, Monica said, laughing. We normally gush about our daughter so much that it's the only thing we ever talk about. George felt a lot better after having that conversation with Ben and Monica. They weren't angry at him at all, only showing him affection he hadn't felt in a long time. After eating, George went outside to start getting to work. He couldn't believe that when he woke up this morning, he was about to leave the farm, likely wandering somewhere else, though he had no idea where the heck he was going to go. George felt at home here. He hadn't been here for long, but it didn't change the fact that this place was starting to feel like home to him. When he was out there working with Tom, he talked to him a little bit, but it was mostly just casual conversation. The weather was beautiful today at the farm. Most days were beautiful, but it was today. He had to stop for a few minutes, just to take in the sights. Sighing, George realized he hadn't thought about Jessica or Michael since the first day he arrived here. His mind was so preoccupied with work and just making the most out of his life right now that it was the farthest thing from his mind. At some point, George realized he did need to start putting up the new fencing. It might not do much in keeping those damn McFarland boys out, but he would be damned if he wasn't going to try to do something. They had no right to come onto this property to try to steal cattle or do anything nefarious. Just because their family had money and power didn't mean they could do everything and anything they wanted. George wished he could find some way to get it through their damn heads sometime. While he was working on the fencing, he saw someone riding a horse in his direction. They were riding towards him fast, but George didn't pay any mind. He figured they were just riding their house around the area, so why pay any attention to it? But then he heard someone shouting at him, "Hey, you, turn around and raise your hands in the air." Bewildered, George turned around and did as the woman asked. He saw that she was sitting on a horse, but she had a large cowboy hat on which was obscuring her face, so he couldn't make out any of her facial features. "Yes, can I help you?" "I said you need to stop whatever you are doing and step aside." The woman finally lifted her head. When he saw her face, his heart skipped a beat. She was beautiful. Long, curly red hair that was tied back in a braid with the bluest eyes he had ever seen. It was like they were staring into his soul or something. "I work here, ma'am," he explained, trying to appear as friendly as he could. "Ben and Monica hired me a few weeks ago." She scowled. "Bull crap. I know you were sent by one of those McFarland boys to destroy our property, but you know what? I won't have it." It hit George just then that this woman must have been Emily, who was away in college, or supposed to be. He chuckled, giving her a soft smile. "Really?" "Yes, really." He chuckled again. "Ben is a good guy to work for, you know? And I love having Monsia's delicious eggs every morning. I don't think anyone has ever made such great eggs. But the one thing I don't understand is your father always having black coffee every morning. It's truly disgusting. I hate black coffee." The way Emily's face turned to one of anger and then shock was truly something he was going to commit to his mind. "I see," she said, voice flat. "So, do you think I could let my hands down now and get back to working? I want to get this fence up so I can stop those pesky McFarland boys from trying to sneak back here onto the farm." She didn't say anything. All Emily did was turn around on the horse and start riding in the opposite direction. Once she was out of sight, George just chuckled and went back to work. So that was Emily, the daughter of Ben and Monica, whom he had just learned about. She was beautiful, and he couldn't stop thinking about how lovely she was. Those eyes, her beautiful red hair, and just the way she carried herself. George was hoping he would be able to get to know her at some point, but it was going to be difficult with how she looked at him after their awkward encounter. What were they going to say to each other when they saw one another again? He shook his head, deciding he wasn't going to let the thought overwhelm him. With Emily out of his mind, he went back to working on the fence. It started to look like a real fence. Now there still was a lot of work he had to do on it. This was going to be a project that was going to go on for a while, but George was still happy with how it was starting to look. During dinner that night, George came into the dining room and saw that Emily was there. Mancha smiled. "George, this is our daughter Emily who came home on break." George chuckled while Emily wouldn't meet his gaze. "Oh, we've met," he said. Ben blinked. "When did the two of you meet?" "We met earlier while Emily was going for a horse ride. She thought I was working with the McFarland boys." Emily scowled. "Can you blame me for thinking that given everything we have been through?" "Well, it's nice to finally meet you, Emily." During the dinner, George noticed that Emily kept looking at him, but whenever their gazes locked, she quickly looked away out of embarrassment. He would grin at her, causing her to blush. He barely knew her, but he could feel this spark between them. George hadn't felt this spark, ever. Even when it came to his ex-wife, Jessica, he realized that he never felt like that with her. It was just his first serious relationship, and moving to the next step every couple of months made sense. This was one of those rare moments where George even thought of Jessica or Michael. He imagined that the two of them were still together, or so he thought. They wanted to be together so badly, so it made sense without him around. But he wasn't going to think of them, especially not right now. He was having a good dinner, enjoying quality time with Monica and Ben, as well as Emily. During dinner, Emily was very quiet and didn't say much to him. When he wasn't around, he could hear her talking to her parents, which made him smile. She had a lovely voice and sounded so sure of herself. A couple of times he overheard her telling Monica that she was embarrassed over how she treated George. Mancha encouraged her to apologize to him. She did, but it was a mumbled apology that George barely even heard. When he realized what she said, he just smiled at her and nodded. She blushed, turning away from him again. It was a shame he couldn't have a serious conversation with her without Emily rushing off somewhere. Working on the farm did keep him busy for the most part. He loved throwing himself into work. There was just something about manual labor that made him feel good about himself. What would life have been for him if he ended up growing up on a farm? Life could have gone a lot differently for him. His parents were both hard workers. They died in a car crash, leaving him in foster care. George threw himself into school, knowing it was the only way for him to get anywhere in life. Without it, he would amount to nothing. Yet here he was, at 30 years old, working on a farm of all places. His college education wasn't helping him here. All those years in school had been wasted. At least George had gotten a scholarship, so it wasn't like he had to pay much back. Anything he had to pay back had been paid back ages ago. Most of the time when George was working at the farm, he and Emily would run into each other. She was on break from school, but she made it clear that she was going to be working around the farm, helping as much as she could. But the two of them didn't talk much. Emily was quiet whenever they interacted, choosing to keep to herself. She was still smarting from their last conversation way back when she accused him of working with the McFarland boys. He would just chuckle, knowing that Emily was going to come around eventually. It was just going to take some time. But one day something happened that changed everything. George was working on the farm as usual, tending to a section of the fence near the creek that bordered the property. The creek was a place he often found solace, a quiet spot where he could sit and listen to the gentle flow of water, letting the soothing sounds wash over him. Today, however, his routine was different. He was finishing up repairs on the fence. his hands moving methodically as he hammered the last nail into place. Once the work was done, George decided to take a walk along the creek, hoping to clear his mind. The past few weeks had been rough, and the fresh air always helped him think. He moved along the path, the familiar sights and sounds of the farm easing some of the tension in his shoulders. But as he walked further, something caught his eye: movement in the bushes up ahead. George slowed his pace, his instincts kicking in. There was something off about the way the leaves rustled. He edged closer, his heart rate picking up as he realized there was a man crouched in the undergrowth. The stranger had a pair of binoculars pressed to his face, intently watching something in the distance. George's body went rigid with a surge of anger and protectiveness. What the hell was this guy doing on the property, and why was he spying? Moving silently, George crept closer, careful not to make a sound. As he got nearer, he noticed something that made his blood run cold. Tied to a tree nearby was a horse, Emily's horse. His eyes darted further along the creek, and there she was, just a little ways off, blissfully unaware of the danger. Emily had taken off her top and pants, revealing a one-piece swimsuit as she prepared to enjoy the water. Rage flooded through George as he realized the man was spying on Emily, his binoculars trained on her as she innocently waded into the creek. George's hands tightened into fists. He wasn't going to let this creep get away with it. With silent determination, George approached the man from behind. The guy was so focused on his vile voyeurism that he didn't even hear George coming. Without hesitation, George struck, delivering a hard blow right underneath the man's ribcage. The force of the hit sent the man flying forward, his binoculars slipping from his grasp as he tumbled into the creek with a splash. The man flailed in the water, shouting in surprise and pain. George's heart pounded in his chest as the man struggled to his feet, sputtering and cursing. When he finally turned around, George felt a sickening lurch in his stomach. It was one of those McFarland boys again, the same ones who had caused him so much trouble before. Emily jumped up out of the water, quickly throwing on her clothes. But George didn't turn his attention from the man. "I thought I told you to stay the hell away from this farm," he hissed. "Listen, this is your last warning. If I see you here again, I will beat you to a bloody pulp." With a glare, George released the man. Turning back to Emily, he grabbed her boots and handed them back to Emily. She was dressed, drying her hair with the towel she brought. "What are you doing here? Were you spying on me just like that McFarland boy?" He chuckled. "No, I came across him and decided to teach him a lesson about spying on people." "Oh. Just oh?" George asked, lifting a brow. George chuckled, shaking his head. Emily arched an eyebrow, clearly not convinced yet. "And what kind of lesson did you teach him, exactly?" George leaned in slightly, lowering his voice as if sharing a secret. "The kind that involves a quick dip in the creek. Figured he could use a cool-off." Emily bit back a smile, though her eyes sparkled with amusement. "So, you're telling me you just happened to be around when he was being a creep?" "Maybe I've got a sixth sense for trouble," George replied, his tone playful. "Or maybe I just like the sound of a good splash." Emily crossed her arms, still pretending to be annoyed, though the corners of her mouth twitched. "And what were you really doing out here, George? If you weren't spying on me, what were you up to?" He gave her a mock-serious look. "I was fixing the fence just like I'm supposed to. But if you're worried I was peeking, I promise. My focus was on the fence posts, not on you." Emily rolled her eyes, finally letting out a small laugh. "Yeah, sure. I'll believe that when pigs fly." George grinned, enjoying the banter. "Come on, Emily, give me some credit. I might be a lot of things, but a peeping Tom isn't one of them." She huffed, trying to maintain her stern expression. "I suppose you did manage to chase off the creep, so I'll let you off the hook this time." "Glad to know I've earned a little trust," George said with a wink. Emily shook her head, finally easing up. George tipped his head toward her with a playful grin. "Well, next time, try not to cause too much trouble. I can only save damsels in distress so many times before it starts to look like a full-time job." Emily finally laughed, a genuine sound that seemed to break the last bit of tension between them. "I think you like the challenge, George. Besides, who says I'm the damsel?" George chuckled, raising his hands in mock surrender. All right. No damsels here. Just a stubborn farm girl and a guy who keeps finding himself in the wrong place at the right time. Emily shook her head. Just make sure you stay on my good side, George. Wouldn't dream of doing otherwise, he said, his tone light but sincere. Emily sighed. I am sorry for every misunderstanding we've had since I came back home to visit. What I should be doing is thanking you for what you did just now. From there, a friendship started to form between them. Emily was no longer hostile. She kept apologizing for how she had been acting and the way she had treated George. But George didn't blame her for anything. He understood why she was so uneasy when she came home that day to find him standing on the farm. Why would she think anything different after being harassed by that family next door for so long? His heart went out to the entire family who was starting to feel like his own. George had never said as much, but he hoped that Ben and Monica were feeling the same way. Then there was Emily. George was starting to realize just how much of a connection he had with Emily. The more time they spent together, the more he found himself drawn to her in ways he hadn't expected. Now that they were on speaking terms, those little conversations turned into something deeper. George found himself opening up to Emily, sharing parts of his life he hadn't told anyone before. It felt natural, almost as if he'd been waiting for someone like her to come along. One evening, something between them shifted. They were sitting on the porch, talking like they usually did, when suddenly the space between them seemed to shrink. George wasn't sure how it started. One moment, they were laughing about something silly, and the next, they were inches apart, the air thick with unspoken feelings. Before he knew it, they were in each other's arms, their lips meeting in a tender, hesitant kiss. It was soft at first, almost like they were testing the waters, but then it deepened, and George felt a warmth spread through him that he hadn't felt in years. Kissing her felt so right. Nothing in his life had ever felt so right before now. He gently cupped her cheek, his thumb brushing against her soft skin as he pulled her closer. Emily responded by shifting nearer, her arms wrapping around him as if she didn't want to let go. The world around them seemed to fade away, leaving just the two of them in that moment, lost in each other. They spent the rest of the evening outside, wrapped in each other's arms, sharing kisses that ranged from sweet and gentle to passionate and deep. The night air was cool, but neither of them noticed. They only felt the warmth of each other's embrace, the steady rhythm of their hearts beating in sync. At some point, they stopped talking altogether, content to simply be close, to enjoy the comfort of their newfound intimacy. The connection they'd been building had finally blossomed into something more, something neither of them had anticipated, but both seemed to welcome with open arms. As the stars appeared overhead, George found himself gazing down at Emily, a soft smile on his lips. He didn't need to say anything. The look in her eyes told him everything he needed to know. This was something real, something special, and for the first time in a long while, George felt a sense of peace. The two of them stayed like that until the early hours, wrapped up in each other and the quiet joy of discovering something new together. The more time they spent together, the more George began to open up about his life. Emily listened, heartbroken by what she was hearing. She gave his hand a gentle squeeze. Your wife cheated with your best friend? George nodded. Yes, I walked right in on them too, but they never knew it because I walked right out. Thinking about it once upon a time used to make him sad, but he didn't care about that anymore. It no longer filled him with a lot of pain. The way Emily was looking at him was with slight pity and anger, but it wasn't anger towards him. It was anger towards what his ex-wife had done. I suppose no one knows how they are going to react to such a thing. It felt like I was numb for a while. Leaving felt like the best thing to do so I could get my head on straight, so I left a note and the divorce papers, George explained with a sad smile. I haven't been back since. Emily kissed him gently on his lips. Then you met my parents at the truck stop. Yes, though I never learned what they were doing there. There is this spot they like that's about an hour's drive from the farm. It's at the top of a hiking trail, and given their age, they don't have a chance or the energy to go there very often, but I guess they felt up to it that night. He blinked. Wow, what are the odds that the day they decided to make that trip, I happened to be walking into the same truck stop? Strange odds, but I'm glad that you three happened to run into each other. George grinned. Really? Is it not obvious? No, it is, but I still like to hear it. Emily playfully smacked him on the chest. George, you can be such a pain. Yes, but you like me, don't you? She blushed. Yes, I hope the feeling is mutual, isn't it? Yes, but I hope you already know that. I try to make it obvious. The two of them shared another kiss. George didn't want to say it out loud yet, but he was pretty sure he was falling in love with this woman in his arms. He never thought he would find this kind of love that felt so effortless. He wasn't sure if Emily's parents, Ben and Monica, happened to notice that they were dating each other. When they went out on their little dates, the two of them were sneaking around the farm, trying not to get caught. Monica commented on how the two seemed closer, but Emily muttered something about the two of them forging a friendship. If they were to find out the truth, George didn't think they would mind. The pair liked George, so if they discovered he was dating Emily, they might embrace the idea, exclaiming that they were very excited about it. But just to be sure, Emily and George wanted to keep it quiet for the time being. It was still in the early stages as well, so George wanted to keep it just between the two of them. While he was pretty sure he was in love with Emily, anything could change. Life was unpredictable. After what George found that afternoon when he got home from work, this was very, very true. It could throw you unexpected curveballs when you least expected it, so he wanted to take his time with this relationship and see where it went. Emily was still in the process of finishing her last year in college, so it was clear she wanted to focus on the same thing. Sometime into the romance, Emily finally started to open some more to George, which made his heart swell. I wish the farm was doing better, she whispered one night after they had finished eating some of the food they brought along on their nighttime picnic. How so? She leaned against George, resting her head on his shoulder. The farm is dying, George. I wish we could move our house far away from the McFarland property and build or buy a new one that's on sale on the other side of the farm. Then we could leave the rest of the property as grazing land for the cattle. There's nothing wrong with dreaming of something better, George murmured, kissing the top of her head. On the day Emily had to go back to college, he gave her a hug and a kiss. It was her graduation year, so it wasn't like the two of them weren't going to see each other again. However, once she was gone, George started to think. He wanted to go see that house on sale that was next to Ben's farm. When he first saw it, he realized how much renovation it needed. A quick call to his lawyer/friend led to Ben deciding to decide his life. George wanted to make sure that he could easily take out his money. His lawyer said it would take about a week or two, but the funds would eventually be in his bank account. He asked George 3 times if he was sure, but George assured him that he had never been so sure of something in his entire life. What he was going to do was buy this property and start fixing it up. Then Emily would be able to make her dream come true. But it was also more than that. George wanted to do this to make his dream come true. By looking at the building, George could picture in his mind perfectly what it was going to look like. He was going to make this house and land into a home. His home. It was a bit scary to go forward with this plan without speaking to anyone about it other than his lawyer. But it was something he had to do. This place was a place he felt like was home for the first time in his entire life. It was sad that he had spent so long with Jessica, never able to feel like what they had together was home. But that was his past, and this was his present as well as his future. Chuckling to himself, George was looking forward to when the money was going to be finally in there. Somehow he was going to have to keep it a secret from the family. It wasn't going to be easy, of course. It was a few months later that Emily finally came back. They had been keeping in contact with each other through phone calls and letters, so it wasn't like they weren't still talking, at least every day. He was so happy when she came back. The two hugged and he never wanted to let her go. When her parents were asleep, they went into the barn and spent a night together. It felt so good to be in her arms again. George would have loved to sleep next to her for the rest of the night, but he had something to tell her. Frowning, Emily got dressed and allowed George to lead her to the property next to the farm. She kept warning him that they were trespassing, but George kept pulling her toward the house, saying it was okay. It looks even more amazing up close, she said with a soft sigh. I wish this was ours. George smiled. It is ours. What? He kissed her and sat her down. I bought it. No, you didn't, Emily exclaimed, gasping loudly when he pulled out a set of keys. Yes, I did. After sitting her down, George told her a little more of the story beyond the cheating part. He said that he had invested everything he earned when he left his ex, but recently he decided to sell every investment he made to buy this property. Are you saying this is yours? Not mine, ours. Emily squealed, throwing her arms around George. The two of them held each other tightly, enjoying the news, but George had more to tell her. Why do you keep smiling at me? I have something else to tell you. She blinked. Yes? Well, it's more of a question. Then ask it. George chuckled, getting down to one knee. Will you marry me? For a while, she didn't say anything. Then she threw her arms around George again and kissed him deeply. Yes, I'll marry you. The two of them spent the night in the house, having a continuation of their romantic night. George had never been so happy. Not only was he building a life here on the farm, but he was also engaged to be married to the woman he loved more than anything. There still was the issue with telling Ben and Monica one day about their relationship. They were going to have to tell them sooner rather than later. It was going to get obvious that they were in a relationship when they saw matching wedding rings on their hands. The best time to tell someone you love this kind of news was to say it during an important day, around a holiday or something. They decided that they were going to tell them around Thanksgiving, or rather, on Thanksgiving. When the holiday started, it was like any other. George was helping Tom around the farm as he always did, while Emily was helping her mother Monica with the cooking. Ben was focusing on the turkey, which was his specialty. The man was always good at cooking turkeys. George didn't have any first-hand experience, but he had heard stories from Monica during his time living here. The two of them had prepared a speech the closer and closer they got to Thanksgiving, but rehearsing things never quite went as planned. Monica was the first to notice the ring on Emily's finger. She gasped softly. Emily, where did you get such a lovely ring? It almost looks like an engagement ring, she said with a laugh. Emily smiled shyly. It is an engagement ring, Mom. Who are you engaged to? Ben asked, the shock evident in his voice. George cleared his throat. She's engaged to me. What? Ben gasped while Monica laughed. I knew the two of you were together. Your father kept telling me I was imagining things, but I knew you were together. Emily bit down on her bottom lip. Mom, Dad, are the two of you happy for us? Of course, Monica exclaimed. Right, Ben? He nodded. Yes, of course. We love George and would love to have him become a part of our family. The two of them spent some time just gushing over the news. There was still a lot of information they had to tell them. Emily and George were thrilled about the house, which was not only going to be theirs, but it was also going to be Ben and Monica's. With the house now theirs, they could sell this farmhouse to the McFarland family, who could never seem to leave them alone. It would get them out of their hair while also not requiring them to move very far away to start their new life. We have something else to tell you, George said with a smile. Monica gasped. Oh my, are you pregnant? Mom, no, Emily cried, turning red. It's too soon for that. Ben sighed in relief. It is. Please, I don't know if I'm ready to be a grandfather. Honey, we are already old, Monica snapped. I would like to enjoy being a grandmother before I'm no longer able to keep up with them. The two had Emily late in life, so they were up there in age. They had always wanted kids and struggled a bit, but finally, after years of trying, the two of them got pregnant. No one could ask for a better daughter than Emily. Mom, can we please not talk about children yet? George chuckled. Instead of telling you, why don't we show you? The two of them led Monica and Ben out to the house that George had been working on. When they saw it, the two of them looked so confused. What is this? The house I bought, George said, smiling. It's for all of us. There were a lot of tears after that, but they weren't sad or angry. Tears, rather, they were happy ones. Everyone hugged, embracing the fact that they were now going to be family. The next step was planning the wedding. It was tough work planning a wedding. George had done it before, but this time it didn't feel like a chore. He was planning a wedding with a woman that he genuinely loved and wanted to spend the rest of his life with. On the day of the wedding, George was a nervous wreck. He remembered pacing in the dressing room as he got married, heart beating in his chest. It wasn't like he was having any doubts, but the fact that he was going to be married to Emily was more than his heart could handle. When he stood at the altar and saw Emily walk out of there wearing her mother's wedding dress, all his worries vanished. The two of them said their vows, kissing the second the priest said they could. George felt like he wanted to cry because of how happy he was. Life couldn't seem to get any better, but it was about to because a year later they had a baby boy with bright red hair and blue eyes. Stephen looked like the spitting image of Emily, but had George's nose and other facial features. George had always wanted to have children. He couldn't imagine what would have happened if he had children with Jessica. She would have been terrible to have children with and likely a terrible mother. It was something terrible to say, but it was the truth. Stephen was the best baby. He didn't cry a lot and was quiet, often looking like he was contemplating the world or something. Most times it was just gas. With the extra money they had, they were able to do the farm work and hire another farmhand. It was amazing that shifting to this part of the land had done wonders for the farm. Everything was working out. One of the best things was being able to see Ben and Monica begin to take it easy. Emily and George were taking charge now, ready to take over the farm. One thing George didn't think much about was his old life with Jessica. The more time that passed, the less he hated her and the entire situation with Michael. Hopefully, the two of them had gone on with their life to find some happiness. But there was one thing they would never have. They would never have the true happiness he had found with Emily. 2 years had passed. George was working on the farm when he saw a car pull into the driveway. Frowning at first, he wasn't sure who it was, but then it hit him who the car belonged to. It was his ex-wife's car. He hadn't seen it in years, but it was her car. The car had seen better days. Swallowing, he walked down the driveway into the car. "George, it is you!" Jessica cried, rushing towards him. "Oh my God, I can't believe you are here. I've spent the past 2 years searching for you. It took me so long to figure out why you left until I realized you must have learned about the affair." He blinked. "Hello, Jessica. That's all you have to say?" "What else would I have to say to my ex-wife?" She huffed. "I only signed those papers because your lawyer made it clear it would be a problem if I tried to contest it." "Well, I'm glad for that because it would have been a lot of trouble for you." Jessica frowned. "Look, George, I'm here because I want to start over. I still love you and want us to try again. What I did to you wasn't right, and I certainly don't deserve your forgiveness, but I'm asking it anyway." George had no idea how Jessica had even managed to find him in the first place, but to think that they saw each other for the first time in years and she said, "This crap," he almost wanted to laugh. This was how ridiculous he found it to be. "Jessica, I think you need to leave," he said with a sigh. This made her tear up and take a step towards him. "Please, George, I want us to have another chance." Before he could say anything, he heard Stephen yelling out to Daddy. When he turned to look over his shoulder, Emily was standing there, holding Stephen in her arms. They both waved to him and went back inside. She narrowed her eyes. "You started another family? Are you serious?" "Well, you cheated on me with Michael. Why didn't you go start one with him or something?" Jessica screamed, giving him a shove. "You are such a jerk." Before leaving, she screamed many other choice words at him before hopping in her car and driving away. George chuckled, turning around to head back inside to go be with his family.